John Kukla, author of A Wilderness So Immense. Where's that title come from?
Part of it's based on a quote, but we kind of adapted it from a quotation in which people talk about the immensity of the wilderness. It's actually a Federalist who was appalled that the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson had bought the place. He was against it. So that was kind of a fun part of the irony of using that in the quotation.
Well, the place, I should say, is the Louisiana Purchase and the Destiny of America, which is the subtitle.
Yes, sir.
When did we, as a country, buy Louisiana?
We bought it by treaty in April of 1803.
What was it?
It was the western watershed of the Mississippi River, and what they called then the Isle of Orleans, which is basically the city of New Orleans, or now Orleans Parish, or the city of New Orleans. And so it's basically something, depending on how you count them up, 13 states and little parts of a couple of others.
So but if you just drew a line from...
If you went from New Orleans north to Minnesota and Canada and west to the Rockies.
Why did we buy it?
We bought it because it was offered to us. It was really, that vast territory was really incidental to what the United States really wanted, which was simply the city of New Orleans, the Port of New Orleans, because the Port of New Orleans controls the navigation of not only the Mississippi River, but also the Ohio River. And at that point, of course, the United States was all east of the Mississippi River, and the farmers and merchants in Kentucky and Tennessee were desperate to have the use of the Ohio River to export their crops.
What did we pay for it?
We paid $15 million.
Although you say in your book, by the time all the interest was paid, it was what, 24?
It was about 27. Yeah, they financed it for 20 years at 6%. So by the time all the notes are paid off in 1823, it's about $27 million, and that's where when you hear that it was 4 cents an acre, that's the figure that they're using for that computation.
How big a deal was it then?
It was an enormous deal. Jefferson was just flabbergasted when the word came back at the extent of the piece of property that had been purchased, and he wrote a number of letters. He got word roughly around the 3rd of July, 1803. Wrote a number of letters, and the responses from people that he wrote to are interesting, because half a dozen of those folks make the comparison that the Louisiana Purchase is equal in importance to the Declaration of Independence and to the writing of the Constitution.
Why?
Well, but what it did is it secured the western watershed of the Mississippi River and the use of the Mississippi River, and in that way it put an end to the regional tensions that basically could have split the country at the peak of the Appalachian Mountains, because the Westerners desperately needed to use the river, and there had been some separatist movements in the 1780s in Kentucky and Tennessee. So it secured that the use of that river, and then of course it also meant that the nation was going to be able to expand considerably across the continent to the Rockies without having a neighbor on that side on the west.
How many people lived inside the territory?
At the time, there were about 50,000. Very relatively small population.
The entire Louisiana?
Now, that would be 50,000 Europeans. Yeah. It's relatively small. In fact, part of the pressure that the Spanish had being exerted on them in the decade before the Louisiana Purchase is one of population, because there's a significant movement of people over the mountains into Kentucky and Tennessee. So if you start immediately after the American Revolution, let's say 1785, there's roughly 30,000 Americans who've gone over the mountains into Kentucky and Tennessee, and there's roughly 30,000 French and Spanish inhabitants of Louisiana. By 1800, Louisiana has got about 50,000, but the numbers in Kentucky and Tennessee are roughly 326 million. 326,000, I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's like the increase in population is like 7 or 8-fold at least.
These sentences got my attention on page 4. Thomas Jefferson, and I'll take this slowly, never traveled west of the Shenandoah Valley.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Livingston never got beyond the Catskills.
Mm-hmm.
James Monroe never made it west of Erie, Pennsylvania. Napoleon Bonaparte never visited America, and his ministers knew only the Atlantic coast. and one of his ministers, Francois, is it Barbé
Marbois.
once visited the Mohawk Valley from his diplomatic post in New York City during the last years of the American Revolution. And Charles Maurice of Talleyrand sat out the Reign of Terror in Philadelphia. Why did you put that in there? What were your point were you making?
The point that I was making is that the story of this diplomatic story is the story of elite white leaders making decisions based on information that they have to glean from all kinds of sources, but that they've never they themselves never set foot in the territories that were being affected by their decision making.
Why should anyone care about this and this 200th anniversary?
I think there's two reasons. The one that jumps to people's mind is the land transaction, the size, and clearly that's phenomenally important in American history, because it does reshape the continent of North America. When you think about it, I was working with a documentary producer who was trying to reach out to younger children. And he wanted me to speculate, which is something historians don't like to do, but he wanted me to speculate on what North America would look like if there hadn't been a Louisiana Purchase. And you begin to, if you play that game, and it's probably a legitimate game, if you play that game, Canada's boundaries would probably have extended down from sort of Lake Erie to St. Louis. There'd be a Spanish or a French regime in charge of New Orleans and what's now Louisiana, the state of Louisiana, state of Arkansas, and so on. It's likely that if the government under the Constitution of the 13 original states, if that government had not been able to secure the navigation of the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers for the Kentuckians and the Tennesseans, they probably would have split off. And there was a secessionist movement in New England that probably would have pulled it apart too. And so we would have had a balkanized kind of map of North America with all of the attendant irritants and abrasion that goes with that. So there's that geographic response to the significance. And the other significance is one that I think is one that we can now understand 200 years after the event, and that is the way in which to engage in a broad caricature. The first 200 years of American history, from Jamestown in 1607 to the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, created a white male agrarian Protestant civic world on the East Coast. And at New Orleans in 1803, that world confronted French, Spanish, free people of color, which was an extraordinary shock to the American understanding of race relations and so on, in an urban setting. And so I kind of see that as the beginning of an encounter with diversity about 200 years ago, and that encounter with diversity both through immigration and through expansion has characterized the second 200 years of American history. So I think for those, both the geographical and the human dimensions, I think those are the two ways in which I think it's worth pausing to contemplate the significance of this event.
How many books have you written?
I've written a number of books that have been monographs for scholars. This is the first time that I've written book length with the desire to reach a general readership rather than just a few of my peers.
Where'd you get the idea?
The idea came to me when I was in New Orleans. I'd spent almost 20 years in Virginia studying Virginia history and working in Virginia, and I went and took a position in New Orleans, and I was completely bewildered as to how that really fascinating, exotic, and wonderful city, how its history related to the world of 18th century America that I'd spent so much time trying to figure out. And eventually, I think the book is my answer to that question that was puzzling me.
But Arthur Schlesinger, the junior, the historian, had something to do with this, you say in your introduction.
Yes, yeah. What happened is I'd been, in 1993, we played host, I was then director of the Historic New Orleans Collection in the French Quarter, and we played host to the celebrations of Jefferson's 250th birthday. And it got me to thinking about the fact that the 2003 was coming up, and that some advanced planning might mean that there'd be civic and educational programs that could be put into place when the politicians realized that there was an anniversary within their term of office. So I began brought together some people from universities and museums in Louisiana to begin thinking about this, and I also began looking for a good book to read. And when in 1998, I think it was, found myself on a program sitting next to Professor Schlesinger and was picking his brain because I had not found the book that I wanted to read, and I thought perhaps he might know of something that I'd missed. And when I said that I hadn't found it, he couldn't come up with any more titles, and I said, you know, I've been thinking of writing it, and he just focused in on me, just looked me right in the eye and said, that would be a good reason for you to write that book. So
how did you go about it?
By that time I'd done a considerable amount of reading, and so I simply began. As a writer, I'd always had to write. If I'm writing an article, I got to get the first paragraph. If I'm writing a short piece, you know, I have to get the first sentence. I figured that given the way I write, what I needed to do was nail down the first chapter, and so I wrote the first chapter about the same time that I was working up the book proposal that you know, for submission to publishers to get the contract.
The one with the title "Piece by Piece."
Yeah. That was my initial draft. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You started.
I mean, it's been reworked, you know, over the subsequent months, of course.
The skies over Paris were cloudy on Wednesday, January 25th, 1786, and the early morning temperature was 42 degrees in the courtyard of the elegant new mansion. On and on. How long did it take you to start that? And why start it that way?
One of the things that it took quite a while to figure out, although somehow the fact that Jefferson for 50 years of his life took the temperature twice a day, and if you look at his commonplace books, he did this. I mean, if I decided to do, you know, exercises or something like that, for, you know, I might go a week with some regularity, but for 50 years of his life, 6 days out of 7 he did get the temperature in the morning, and it's like 5 days out of 7 that on average that he got the temperature written down in the afternoon. And you know, he's just fascinated with weather, and of course that was the way he could work. And somehow that just spoke to me about I don't know, the discipline. It was something that just was kind of quirky and fascinating about him. And then the other thing that I wanted to do in that chapter was try to have a starting place for the story. And it seemed to me that what happens that particular what I focused on is 2 days in Jefferson's life when he's ambassador to Paris, ambassador to France in Paris. And in one of those letters that he writes a series of letters that day, and in one of the letters he writes, and he's basically surveying the state of affairs in Europe. So that was a perfect mechanism to kind of take stock of the situation of the world at the beginning of my story. But the other one is a letter that he writes to a protege, really, in Virginia, in which he's kind of speculating about the future of the continent, and particularly about the fact that many of these western territories are in hands of the Spanish. And he writes that he hopes that the Spanish can hold these territories long enough for us to pluck them from them piece by piece. So there it is, 17 years ahead of the event, if my math is right, and he's already contemplating in his mind the inevitability of American acquisition of what was then Spanish territory. So that seemed to be a good place to start.
As you know, when we learn about the Louisiana Purchase, we always hear about Napoleon, we always hear about France owning it, but you spend a lot of time back and forth, Spain to France. And give us the quick history on who owned that land.
Sure. Louisiana was founded about 1699 by the French, and it was named for King Louis XIV. And then at the end of the 7 Years' War, or in American history, the French and Indian War, the French gave it to the Spanish in order to keep from having to surrender it to Britain. They'd essentially lost in North America to Great Britain, lost Canada, for example. So the Spanish took possession and administered Louisiana from the 1760s up until just weeks before the Americans took possession of it in 1803. So that Spanish domination of Louisiana is often missed. You know, you go visit Louisiana. For the longest time, you ride the streetcars down St. Charles Avenue. For the longest time, when I first got to Louisiana, I figured that St. Charles Avenue, that was probably named for Charlemagne. Well, in fact, it's named for Carlos III, who was the king King of Spain, right on the eve of the Louisiana Purchase.
Well, that takes me to chapter 2. You start by saying at the beginning of the chapter, Carlos III hunted nearly every afternoon from 1 o'clock till dusk.
Yeah.
Roaming the countryside in pursuit of wolves and foxes that preyed on his subjects' farms and livestock. Why the hunting thing? And I guess, didn't his son, it was Carlos IV his son?
Yeah, Carlos IV.
He hunted too.
Carlos IV was the kind of guy who'd like to have the keepers run the deer past the royal stand and blast at him, whereas Carlos III, the father, actually enjoyed going out and tracking and hunting down wolves. So I think he was a real hunter rather than just somebody. But to get back to your question, Carlos III was an amazingly able monarch. When
did he reign?
He came to the throne in the 1750s.
Spain.
Of Spain, yeah, and he died in 1788. So he's there and in charge of Louisiana at the time when I'm starting the story.
You call him the Catholic king.
Yes, that's the term that they used. His most Catholic Majesty was the kind of formal language that shows up in treaties referring to the King of Spain.
You say that his death, though, probably led to the sale eventually of the Louisiana Purchase.
I think. Well, what happens is, I think arguably Carlos III, the father, is one of the most able monarchs probably in all of Spanish history, and his son has, I think, an equally strong claim to be one of the most inept. And so it makes a big difference that you have a less able man facing the challenges of the French Revolution and ultimately of Napoleon and such.
When did Carlos III die?
Boy, I don't remember the exact date. He was forced into exile in 1808, and I think he lived on into the 1820s, but I don't have the exact date in mind.
When did his son take over then?
Carlos III died in 1788, and then his son took over in 1788. Yeah. And then the son eventually Napoleon kicks the Bourbons off the Spanish throne in 1808 and puts his brother on the Spanish throne and sends these guys into exile. That's stuff that isn't, I didn't follow that digression.
In the beginning of your book, you list a number of people that you thought were the principal characters in this whole exchange. One of them was Robert Livingston. Who was he?
Robert Livingston was a New York politician, statesman, and he was Jefferson's minister to France. He'd been active in the Revolution. He was known in New York history as Chancellor Livingston to distinguish him from a whole bunch of Robert. Robert was a really popular name in the Livingston family. In fact, this guy's name was Robert Livingston. But he had been foreign minister for the Continental Congress in the American Revolution, and so was experienced in diplomacy and the like, and was Jefferson's choice to go represent the United States to France when Jefferson came to the presidency.
I wrote this down. You said Robert Livingston made the deal, and James Monroe saved it.
Mm-hmm. Livingston had worked on the idea of trying to get a hold of New Orleans. He had been working on that for months. And then late in the game, Monroe arrives with special authority to negotiate for those purposes. Monroe, I don't think, ever realized how much work Livingston had done before his arrival, and so kind of had an inflated notion of what he had done. Because as far as what Monroe saw, he arrived. They went through 3 weeks of negotiation. They ended up with a treaty, and it looked like it looked like that's when it all happened. But as I think I pretty well document in the book, Livingston had worked long and hard in order to create the situation in which the treaty came about. The sentence that says that Monroe saved it. What happened is after the treaty had been signed and sent back to the United States for ratification, that summer, Napoleon began to have second thoughts, and it was at that point that Monroe, who was even closer to Jefferson than Livingston and had been with him more recently and so on, had the self-confidence to say, "We've been authorized to spend $2 million. Let's give it to him." And Livingston was not sure that was a good idea. turn over $2 million to somebody who's about to back out of a deal. You know, what happens? Monroe insisted that this was the right thing to do, and only Monroe could have done that, because he was, you know, closer to. You can argue about whether Monroe or Madison is closer to Jefferson, but you know, he was basically very, very close personally and politically to Jefferson, and so he had the wherewithal to say let's do it, and that did, in fact, I think. It quelled those fears that Napoleon would try to back out of the treaty.
Do me a favor before we lose you entirely. Your mic is about to fall off. Just slide it back up there, and up a little higher so we can hear you.
Okay.
Sometimes they fall off in the middle of these things. Another name was Talleyrand.
Yeah, Talleyrand is a fascinating character in French history. He starts off as a bishop. And then he leaves the church on the eve of the French Revolution. He's part of that first early kind of aristocratic and liberal rather than extreme period of the first years of the French Revolution. He's a major figure in writing the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. In fact, it's interesting, Mary Wollstonecraft, when she writes about the vindication of the rights of women, dedicates it to Talleyrand because he puts women into the Declaration of Rights and Citizen. And then he gets gets afoul of the more extreme elements in the revolution when the Reign of Terror is about to start, and is able to escape under a diplomatic mission to England, and then ultimately comes and sits out the Reign of Terror in Philadelphia, which he liked about as well as W.C. Fields did. He didn't care for Philadelphia at all. But what happens then after the Reign of Terror is that Talleyrand, whose real forte is foreign relations, comes back and gives two lectures. One at the French Institute. They're very, very well received and published. One of the lectures advocates religious liberty as a way of establishing a stable government by simply trying to get the issue of religious dissension and contention out of politics. So he advocates religious liberty. And the other is he advocates colonies as a way of rebuilding the French Empire, and also as a convenient place to send malcontents. And particularly what he's thinking about is, Napoleon's got all of these victorious soldiers who, what are you going to do with them when peace comes? Well, of course, as it turns out, Napoleon never has to worry about peace. But Talleyrand's thinking about that, and so he reintroduces the idea of colonization, and then that leads in turn to he and Napoleon kind of get connected. He supports Napoleon in the coup that brings Napoleon into office, and Napoleon makes him his foreign minister, and Napoleon is one of his goals is to try to reestablish the French domination of Haiti. Which was then Saint-Domingue, the sugar colony there, which had such an enormous role in the French economy. And so, what Napoleon wants to do is send an expedition to conquer Saint-Domingue, or modern Haiti, put down the revolt of the slaves there, reinstitute slavery, and get that sugar economy working again. And Talleyrand's pretty much all for that. And in fact, this is what causes Napoleon to be interested in Louisiana. He wants to use Louisiana as a place to supply food and firewood and all kinds of mundane commodities that aren't very profitable. That basically the idea is that you don't want to waste slave labor and expensive land in this tropical plantation economy of Haiti, which can be put to use making sugar particularly, but also coffee, indigo, and chocolate. That stuff's profitable. So the idea is that you bring in these other mundane supplies from Louisiana. So that's Napoleon's kind of imperial vision, and that's why he presses the Spanish to cede Louisiana back to him in 1800.
Do I remember you saying that sugar was like 20% of the gross national product of France?
Yeah, it's something like that. And it had a phenomenal role in French overseas trade. Basically, what happened is that they would bring the sugar in from from Saint-Domingue particularly, but also I think Martinique also had it, and the British were frankly doing the same thing in Barbados and Jamaica, but the French would bring it in and then process it and market it throughout Europe. So it represented something like 60% of the foreign shipping of the French shipping trade. It was a phenomenally important part of the French economy.
Let's go back to kind of the dates and try to lay the groundwork. 1803 was when the treaty was signed.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
When did somebody start planning to want to get the Louisiana Territory in this country?
In this country, well, Livingston was working on that idea early on. But
what year, though?
This would be 1800. Livingston when Livingston went to Jefferson is elected in 1800, takes office in 1801. So when Livingston goes to France in 1801, part of what he's interested in is trying to secure, well, I should actually say when the Americans learn that the Spanish are ceding Louisiana back to the French, it's at that point that Livingston and the Americans start working on the idea of we can't let this happen.
So Thomas Jefferson became president in 1801. How old was he then?
He was, let's see, he was born in 43, so he was born in 1743, so he's like 59, 60.
And he spent how many years in France when he was?
He had been there from 84 to 89, so he'd spent about 5 years, 5.5 years.
Okay, then if you just step back a little bit, you have Great Britain at that time in 1801. Who was running Great Britain then?
George III.
And how many people lived there?
Boy, I'm not sure. What, maybe 30, 40 million?
I have no idea.
I would guess.
France was run by...
France, in 1801, France was being run by Napoleon. It had gone from Louis XVI and who was beheaded at the beginning of the Revolution. It had gone through a whole bunch of turmoils and different forms of government, and Napoleon was first consul in 1801, and then of course later on, I think early in 1804, he crowns himself emperor.
You say he had the Constitution changed and they phonied up the votes.
Yes, they did. Yeah, apparently that's one of the things. His brothers did a great job of manufacturing these phenomenal victories at the ballot box that in fact were all frauds.
You have any idea how many people lived in France in 1801?
No, I don't. No.
Cuba was owned by what country?
Cuba was owned by Spain. In fact, Cuba was kind of the base of their administration of the Caribbean area.
Florida.
Florida was owned by Spain.
Canada.
Canada had been owned by France, but as a result of this 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, had been transferred to Great Britain.
When do you bring in General Wilkinson?
Wilkinson shows up in the story in about 1785. He'd been involved in various things in the Revolution. He fought in the Revolution. He's originally from Maryland and had started off thinking he was going to be a physician, but he got interested and became a soldier. And he goes out to Kentucky in 1785, and one of the things that he tries to agitate for is opening the river. The river is periodically being closed. It had been open because the Spanish were surreptitiously helping the Americans during the Revolution, and then once the Revolution was over, they closed it again. So Wilkinson gets all of these Kentucky farmers to donate several boatloads worth of stuff, and he floats it downstream. With the idea that he's going to open the Ohio-Mississippi River trade link, and then when he gets down there, he starts negotiating with the governor of Louisiana with his scheme. He portrays himself as someone who is going to be able to bring Kentucky out of the Union and join it with the Spanish administration in New Orleans, and therefore make it kind of a defensive measure. So he's sort of playing both sides against the middle, and what it seems that he really wants is to develop a trade monopoly where he would be the only one who had the authority to bring Kentucky goods down the river, which would, of course, would, very, very lucrative. But he kind of plays both sides against the river. And the Spanish, I don't think the Spanish really, after a while, they don't believe that he's capable of bringing Kentucky out of the Union. But his information is useful, and so they keep him on the payroll. Past the time of Louisiana Purchase, he's on the Spanish payroll. His secret number was agent number 13, because that's the code that they used with Wilkinson. So he's quite a character. Somebody really ought to write a good book about Wilkinson. It's been 30 years, and the Spanish archives are now available in a way that they weren't under Franco. So
have you thought about it yourself?
I can make it through Spanish documents with a dictionary, and I can run them by friends who can make sure that the transcriptions are good. But I'm not sure that once you get into an archive and you have to deal with both the handwriting and the language, I'm not sure that I could master that one.
But the relation. By the way, you have some Canada in your background.
Yeah, I went to graduate school at the University of Toronto and did a minor in Canadian history. So I've kind of done. In graduate school, I did American, Canadian, and British history. So
where are you from originally?
Originally from Wisconsin.
And where did you go to undergrad?
Carthage College in Kenosha. It's a small Lutheran-related liberal arts school on Lake Michigan.
And how did you get interested in history?
I had a good teacher, that was Nelson Peter Ross, the late Nelson Peter Ross.
Where?
And he was at Carthage. He was. He just kind of turned me on to the discipline. And the other thing was I could never decide as an undergraduate. I couldn't decide what I wanted to major in. And so I've convinced myself that if I majored in history, since that would be everything under the sun from yesterday back, I could put off having to narrow my focus. And in some ways that's been true. I've done had a lot of fun looking into a lot of interesting things.
What was the town that you grew up in Wisconsin?
My parents were teachers, so we moved around a lot as Dad went up through the ranks. But they're originally from Milwaukee, and they're living now in Jefferson. I spent most of high school in a town called Thorpe, which is up near Eau Claire.
There is some reference in here about you, I think, standing on the Mississippi.
Yes, yeah.
When was that?
Yeah, when I was a child. My folks, when I was 5, I guess, they were teaching in a little town called Verndale, Minnesota, north of Minneapolis. And one summer, we went up north of Verndale to Lake Itasca. I have no real honest memories of Lake Itasca, which is the headwaters of the Mississippi River. But I remember seeing a photograph of myself and my sister at Lake Itasca. What I do have an actual memory of is up in Bemidji. They have these big statues at a park there of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox. That I remember. That's an actual memory rather than one that's been helped along with a photograph.
So what did your career? What have you done in your life since then?
Well, after graduate school, I went to Virginia to work on Virginia history and ended up editing a magazine that was then published by the Library of Virginia called Virginia Cavalcade, and became the director of research and publishing at the Library of Virginia, which I did from, I started with the Library of Virginia in '73 and left in 1990 to take a position at the Historic New Orleans Collection. So I spent 17 years doing Virginia history.
And the Library of Virginia is where?
It's in Richmond. It's to the seat of government, the equivalent of the Library of Congress and the archives. It's both a library and archives for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
And what are you doing now?
Right now I'm the director of the Patrick Henry Memorial Foundation, which is at Patrick Henry's last home and his burial place about 100 miles south of Richmond, called Red Hill.
And what's that foundation do today?
We basically have taken it upon ourselves to be the kind of major interpreter of Patrick Henry, in the same way that the Mount Vernon claims Washington and both preserves a site related to him, or Monticello does the same thing for Jefferson, both preserving a site that's related to that man and also trying to do educational programs and the like that simply are there to inform people of what he stood for and what role he played in history.
What kind of money do you spend every year in a foundation like that?
Oh, ours is very small, and the comparison with either Mount Vernon or Monticello is one of a gnat to a giant. Believe me, we've got four full-time people, and I think the budget is roughly about $250,000 a year.
What kind of money do you have to raise, or what kind of money does the foundation have in it, and who gives to a Patrick Henry Foundation in today's age?
We've got a lot of people who support Patrick Henry for his involvement in the Bill of Rights, and we've got a lot of people who support Patrick Henry because they see him as a spokesperson for limited government, which both of those things being positions that he held not only in his arguments with the king and before the Revolution, but also in the ratification debates over whether or not to ratify the Constitution. So I think those are the two things that are what kids remember him for, of course, is give me liberty or give me death. And Henry's an interesting character because he was so prominent in the American mind in the 19th century at a time when the country still valued oratory as not only as a part of political debate but also as entertainment, and because he was not a man of the pen, he's been kind of eclipsed by those people who left voluminous writings.
By the way, the cover of your book, where is this painting from?
The painting, I believe, is in Cincinnati.
You know who did it?
Asher Durand, I think, but I must say that the folks at Knopf's art department are the ones that located that particular painting.
In the pursuit of this subject, the subtitle being the Louisiana Purchase and the Destiny of America, where did you go? Where did you travel? Where did you study?
I hoped at one point, Brian, that I would have to go to Madrid, but I was spared that onerous trip by microfilm at Tulane, and the resources here at the Library of Congress, University of Virginia Library in Charlottesville, and Library of Virginia, and others. So most of my travels were actually east of the Mississippi into parts of the territory that I had not previously visited. The Kentucky and Tennessee and Mississippi, what's now the state of Mississippi, they figure prominently in a lot of the jostling that goes on in the kind of the background to it, and there were just parts of that territory that I was unfamiliar with, and then there were archives there that I had not occasion to use. So in 1999, I took about a 7-week research trip in which I just wandered. I had some destinations in mind, archives in mind, and collections that I wanted to use. But I also would just whenever I saw those brown signs that mark local museums, I stopped at those sort of things. And what I was trying to do was to try to keep from making mistakes. I'm not sure that certainly I learned things, but for example, I remember stopping in Chattanooga, and I had never quite figured out how Chattanooga fit in with, because it's not part of the early history of Tennessee. It doesn't get treated I went in this local museum, and the first panels in there have to do with the Cherokee dominance of that part of it. And it was like, oh yeah, until Jackson kicked them out, that's where they were. No wonder it's not a place of extensive European settlement in, say, 1800. And so it was. I did a lot of that kind of traveling. At one time I thought that the Natchez Trace would figure in the story. I'm not even sure that, frankly, it gets mentioned.
What is that, by the way?
That's the road that runs from Nashville to Natchez, or I guess we really should say from Natchez to Nashville. It's the road that, after the Louisiana Purchase, it's the road that was used by a lot of the Tennessee and Kentucky farmers who would float their goods down to market, and then dismantle the boat and sell the lumber, and then make their way up to Natchez, and then go either by horse or by foot back up into the bluegrass country.
This sentence, and I know you know what it's talking about. I mean, when you read these books, it's always fun to read these kind of sentences. This remarkable document, Perrin, which has never been published or consulted by American historians, Perrin, confirms Monroe's suspicions. Quote, not finding a better occasion, is it Gardoqui?
Gardoqui, as I understand, yeah.
Who was?
He was the Spanish ambassador to the United States in the he arrived in 1785, so he's there right before the writing of the Constitution.
Okay, quoting again. Not finding a better occasion, Gardoqui wrote, I take advantage of the French mail to tell you that we are in a critical time. Never in Congress has there been a controversy more combated than that of our Mississippi. Where did you find this, and why have historians not consulted it? Why has it never been published before?
That's a great story, and thanks for asking. There's been a contention. What's the background here is that Monroe wrote letters to Patrick Henry when he happened to be governor of Virginia at the time.
James Monroe was governor.
James Monroe was in Congress.
James
Monroe from Congress. This is in 1785 and 1786, and he writes letters to Patrick Henry reporting on for the congressional delegation as to what was going on, and he describes what seemed in his letters at face value to be a movement on the part of a bunch of particularly Massachusetts, but also a few Connecticut congressmen, to work with John Jay in order to get a Spanish commercial treaty. They were willing to close the Mississippi River, give up the navigation of the Mississippi River for 25 or 30 years. The Virginians were adamantly opposed to this.
Why were they willing to give it up?
Well, from the point of view of Massachusetts, first of all, they didn't think it was important. Secondly, they were not eager to have the lands to the west become profitable, because it only meant that farmers from Massachusetts might leave, or that prospective factory workers might go out, or seamen and sailors might go out. So the idea of opening the West was not anything that folks in Massachusetts, or particularly John Jay, wrote on a number of occasions. This was not something that he thought the country was ready for. And
what was John Jay doing?
John Jay at this time was the principal. Let's see, was it foreign minister, foreign secretary. He was the equivalent for the Congressional Congress before the adoption of the present Constitution. He was basically the equivalent of the Secretary of State. And so he was the one who was deputed to negotiate with the Spanish ambassador.
And this document was, again?
What happened, Brian, is that there's been this Henry letter, so people knew of it, and most people dismissed this as just being hyperbole, that Monroe was just exaggerating, because his contention, frankly, was that the New Englanders were trying to close the river and push the Southerners out of the Union. Well, what I found there's the authoritative big biography of James Monroe. There was a footnote to a dissertation done in 1948 about Gardoqui, the Spanish minister. So I got the dissertation on interlibrary loan and read through the thing, and at the bottom of one of the pages there's a mention of this letter that had something to do with Gardoqui meeting with New Englanders. And then in turn I was able to find an inventory that had been published in the 1940s, and I faxed a request to the archives in Seville. And they sent me a photocopy of the two letters that I wanted, in which this Spanish ambassador is talking about his secret meetings with a junta from El Norte and this sort of thing. And it was at that point that I enlisted the assistance of good friends who do Latin American history to make sure that we got the translation right. But basically, what he was doing in his dispatches. The Spanish ambassador, in his dispatches back to the authorities in Spain, was confirming the fact that he was consulting secretly with some of these New Englanders.
As you know, this is a very complicated story that
absolutely. Yeah.
How did you keep track?
How did I keep track
of all these people, all these
Well, actually, what started in that road trip that I mentioned is I would buy those kind of milk carton things that's used for files. Well, I bought 2 of those and they fit in my trunk. And actually, by the end of the trip, I could fit 3 of them in my trunk. By the end of the book, I think I've got a dozen of them. And I've got them kind of arranged. There's a couple of them that have to do with France, and a couple of them that have to do with Jefferson, and a couple of them that. So basically, I've got the files, and essentially what I did, the way I did most of my research was by whenever possible photocopying things. So I had it to go back to.
In the back of the book, you published some appendix or appendices. You have one is the proposed amendments to the Constitution.
Constitution, that's right.
It never happened, though. Why?
Yeah, what happened is Jefferson had scruples about the constitutionality of the Louisiana Purchase, and the thing that most people jump to, of course, is that there wasn't the authority to buy this big piece of land. Jefferson wasn't terribly troubled about the land deal. What the language that he used to describe the situation is that this was beyond the Constitution. I mean, his basic feeling was that had the guys at Philadelphia thought that anything like this could have happened, they would of course written it in and so on. And he contemplated writing an amendment to the Constitution to kind of sanction what had been done. The trouble that he and others had was in bringing into the Union all of these people who were not accustomed to the democratic ways of American society, who didn't speak English, who had been, who were Catholics and so on. And that's bringing those people into the Union was what troubled Jefferson and the others.
In New Orleans,
the people of Louisiana, the inhabitants of Louisiana.
You point out that they had mixed marriages there.
Yeah, in fact they had a substantial proportion of the population of New Orleans who were free people of color, who were recognized as having a role in society.
And married whites.
And married whites and the like, yeah.
I mean,
a very Caribbean kind of pattern.
One of your sub-themes here is that this was the beginning of eventual
diversity. Yeah, I think so, yeah.
By buying the Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah, it took this, white male Protestant nation, and suddenly, it had to deal with the reality of people that in large numbers in one big event, with people who were very different from what most Americans thought of as they're certainly not they're not Boston former Puritans, and they're not Jefferson's yeoman farmers.
By
these
the way,
are different folks.
When did we get Florida? I know this is out of context.
Florida, we get Florida in the treaty negotiations of 1818 and 1819, which kind of tidy up all that. It takes that long to kind of tidy up all the lines of the Louisiana Purchase.
Did we have to pay for it?
At that point, no.
So we didn't have to pay Spain anything for that.
I don't think so.
All right, now another out of context question. I kept thinking. I kept thinking of a hotel bathroom when you told this story. The bathroom scene.
Yeah.
Of the 3 Napoleons.
Yeah. Now you got. It's possible that this is greatly exaggerated and maybe even apocryphal, because it shows up in one of Napoleon's brother's memoirs published after the fact, and it's pretty clear that he's embellished it a little bit, because there's a point. But the story is basically the British were trying to bribe Napoleon's brothers in order to keep him from buying Louisiana, because they figured that would get him involved in the Caribbean, and it would tie him down and so on. So
at what point are we?
We're in 1802, early 1803.
And the Spanish control it right now.
The Spanish are still in control, but it's well known that Napoleon has signed a treaty and is going to be taking possession. And so what happens, supposedly after one of the performance at the opera, the 2 brothers descend on Napoleon, find him bathing in rose water, and begin to.
First, it's Joseph and Lucian.
Joseph and Lucian, yeah. Joseph is the elder brother. Lucian's the younger brother.
And what are they doing? What's their?
Joseph. Both of them are involved in politics. Lucian is in the National Assembly. And is the one who had been fixing the elections, Joseph, Joseph is also involved in politics, although not quite as actively, I guess. And the idea is that they're going to try to convince Napoleon not to not to sell Louisiana, and particularly they were fearful, and Lucian takes the lead here. They were just appalled that Bonaparte was going to do this on his own without consulting the legislature, and part of this is self-interest. They're concerned that he's going to get himself in such trouble that that the whole Bonaparte family gets itself kicked out of France and so on. And so there's this argument that goes on, and eventually they're shouting at one another, and Bonaparte falls back into the tub, and rose water is splashed everywhere, and one of the valets is supposed to, he's supposed to have fainted. And after this huge splash, Lucian quotes something out of some classical source having to do with calming the seas. That's the part that I think probably got dressed up afterwards when he was writing it in his memoirs. But it's a great story, and what it demonstrates is that at that point which is actually before Monroe arrives in Paris, that Bonaparte was absolutely committed to the idea of selling Louisiana.
So, when the dust settles on this story, who in your opinion, made the biggest difference?
I think Jefferson's handling of this, whatever you want to say about any other parts of Jefferson's career, and there are other brilliant parts and others that people argue about, but his handling of the diplomacy of the Louisiana Purchase is absolutely brilliant. It's just absolutely brilliant. He decides that he wants to bring about a peaceful resolution of it. He uses his representatives, both Livingston and Monroe, beautifully. He also uses Pierre Samuel Dupont as a kind of a back channel messenger to the people around Napoleon. He just plays this beautifully.
But at this time, there are no cell phones. There's no telegraph. There's nothing. There's no mail. Takes how long?
It takes roughly 4 weeks for a message to, you can pretty much count on a message getting across the Atlantic in 4 weeks, sometimes longer. It takes 3 or 4 weeks for a message to get from New Orleans to Washington. So
there's no railroad.
There's no railroads. There's no cell phone. So and Jefferson, I think part of the key here, Brian, is that Jefferson had been an ambassador. He'd been in France trying to represent his nation for 5 years. With these same limitations on communication. So what he does when he appoints Livingston is he takes Livingston into his office, and they spend several days together going over, I guess we'd call them alternate scenarios, so that by the time Livingston goes to France, he knows Jefferson's mind. He knows how he would react to this, that, or the other thing. When he gets a chance to send Monroe, he does the same thing, brings Monroe to his office. They spend a week. By the time those guys get over there, they know Jefferson's mind, they know what he wants, they know how he'd react, because they've played all these things out kind of in speculation. And so they've got his full confidence, and they do a magnificent job. The other thing is he doesn't give them carefully, detailed, limiting written instructions. So it's not like when the French say, we'd like to sell you the whole territory, they're able to say, okay.
The month in 1803 that the treaty was signed.
Treaty was negotiated in April, and it was dated April 30th.
And the Senate did what with it?
Senate passed it in 3 readings, because Napoleon was said to be having second thoughts. Jefferson wanted to push through.
What did the House do?
The House didn't have. The House doesn't have to ratify a treaty.
I know, but you suggested there was.
Subsequently, what happened is when the legislation comes before Congress for the governance of Louisiana, then there are very extensive debates.
When does Thomas Jefferson turn to Meriwether Lewis and William Clark and say, "I want you to go out there"?
The preliminary work with Meriwether Lewis had started prior to the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson had brought him to Washington as his personal secretary, among other things, and then was working on that. And in fact, as I do one of the chapters in the background is a story of an earlier precursor of the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1793, when Jefferson wanted to engage a French botanist named André Michaux in 1793, he wanted to send him from St. Louis up the Missouri River for a variety of reasons. That didn't come about. But Jefferson used the same instructions, recycled the instructions when he drafted the instructions for Lewis and Clark.
All right, it's a little late in this one, but the George Rogers Clark, William Clark connection, and George Rogers Clark did what in all this?
George Rogers Clark had been basically had conquered the West for the United States during the American Revolution, and so he was known as the kind of hero of the West. He'd held the Illinois Territory against the British during the American Revolution, and then basically retired from service. The state of Virginia never paid his bills, and the poor man was driven into the poorhouse in bankruptcy by the bean counters in Richmond. But then he was being approached by the French revolutionaries in the 1790s with the idea that they might lead an expedition down the Mississippi River and take New Orleans.
William Clark's his brother?
William Clark's his younger brother.
And what was their relationship? Did they get along?
Yeah, they got along fine. I mean, there was a considerable age difference between the two of them, but they got along splendidly. And as a matter of fact, William used to help his brother out because of all these debts that had been incurred. George Rogers Clark couldn't even accept land when the government tried to give him land because it would get taken up by the creditors. So William did a lot of that for him.
France, again, out of context, but France abolished slavery in 1794, you say?
Yes. And
what
then,
impact did that have on all this?
Well, it had an enormous impact on the debates over, for example, over Haiti and Saint-Domingue, and the ideals of the French Revolution, even before the actual abolition of slavery, fueled the aspirations of the free people of color, or the mulatto group within Saint-Domingue or Haiti, and led to the beginnings of the Civil War that then became a slave uprising. And of course that whole history of Saint-Domingue and Haiti is an important. It's an important part of the story of the Louisiana Purchase, and it's a much more important part of American history than people recognize.
Out of time, you have another book?
I'm thinking about it. I'm kind of juggling two, and haven't yet written but yeah, I've got another book in the works, but I'm not sure which subject.
Do you want to give us a hint?
I'm thinking about writing about Thomas Jefferson's relationship with women.
A Wilderness So Immense is the title of this book. John Kukla is our guest, and we thank you very much.
Thanks, Brian.